Hi, I'm a 28-year-old guy, and I've been living on my own for the past 5 years. I moved out right after college, landed a decent job, and have been building a comfortable life for myself. My apartment is nothing fancy, but I've worked hard to make it my own, buying furniture, gadgets, and other things little by little. Everything in my space has meaning because I earned it. For me, it's more than just stuff, it's proof that I can stand on my own 2 feet. Now, let me tell you about my family. My younger sister is 25 and recently moved back in with our parents after losing her job. She's been having a rough time financially, and I get it. Life isn't always easy. I moved out partly because my family has always leaned a little too hard on the idea that we should share everything growing up. My stuff wasn't really mine. It was ours. That mindset never sat well with me. Moving out gave me the space and freedom I needed. A couple of weeks ago, I got a call from my mom. She asked me if she could give my old desk and chair, which were still stored at their house, to my sister for her home office. I told her no. I hadn't taken them to my apartment yet because I was waiting until I could make room for them. They're still mine though. I paid for them when I was in college, and I told her I'd come by soon to pick them up. Mom didn't push too hard, just said she understood. I thought that was the end of it. Fast forward about a week. My cousin mentioned in passing during a casual chat that my sister's home office was coming together and that she loved the desk and chair. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then it hit me she was talking about my desk and chair. To make things worse, my cousin added, "Oh, and the gaming console was a nice touch. She said you were cool with it." I wasn't cool with it. I never even knew about it. I drove over to my parents' house that weekend and asked them straight up what had happened. My dad shrugged it off, saying they figured I wouldn't mind since I wasn't actively using the desk or chair. My mom chimed in with something about how my sister needed it more right now. I asked about the gaming console, an old but still functional one I'd bought years ago, and they confirmed they'd given that to her as well. It felt like a punch in the gut. I reminded them that I'd paid for everything with my own money. The desk, the chair, the console, these weren't communal family items. My dad just sighed and said, "You know how families are supposed to share?" My mom added that I should be more understanding because my sister was going through a hard time. I turned to my sister next. She didn't even try to deny it. Her attitude was completely dismissive. She said she needed the desk to apply for jobs and the console to distress when I told her she should have asked me first. She just rolled her eyes and said, "What's the big deal? You weren't using them anyway." That wasn't the point, and she knew it. This wasn't about the desk or the console, it was about respect. It was about boundaries. But anytime I brought that up, my parents and sister would pivot back to how I was being selfish or causing drama. I tried to resolve things peacefully. I asked for my stuff back, just the desk and chair, but my parents acted like that would be impossible. They said taking them back now would disrupt my sister's setup and create unnecessary conflict. I pointed out that the conflict already existed because they went behind my back, but they refused to see it that way. My dad even accused me of being petty, saying, "It's just furniture. Let it go." Frustrated, I turned to Reddit. I posted about the situation, explaining how my parents and sister had completely disregarded my ownership and left me feeling disrespected. The response was overwhelming. People validated my feelings, shared similar stories, and encouraged me to stand my ground. Some even gave detailed advice on how to handle the situation without escalating things too much. Their support gave me the clarity I needed. I decided I wasn't going to let this slide. I couldn't keep letting my family brush aside my boundaries, so I came up with a plan. I would go to my parents' house the next day and reclaim what was mine. But this time, I wouldn't argue or let them guilt me into backing down. I'd simply take back my belongings and leave. Before I ended the call with my dad that night, he warned me not to make a scene if I came over. That just made me more determined. I packed some tools into my car, set my alarm for early the next morning, and got ready to take action. Update 1. The next morning, I got up early, loaded a set of tools into my car, and headed to my parents' house. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I didn't want to give them the chance to stall or come up with excuses. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it was barely 8 a.m. The house was quiet, and I figured everyone was still in their morning routines. When I knocked, my mom answered the door, looking surprised to see me. I told her I was there to pick up my desk and chair. Her expression shifted, like she was trying to figure out how to stop me without outright saying no. Instead of giving her a chance, I stepped inside and headed toward the room where I knew my sister had set up her so-called office. The desk and chair were right there, along with a few other things that looked suspiciously familiar, like my old lamp and a decorative clock I thought I'd thrown away. My mom followed behind, trying to convince me that this wasn't necessary and that we could talk about it later, but I wasn't interested in more talking. I reminded her I'd already made it clear I wanted my stuff back. As I started to take apart the desk, my sister burst into the room. She looked furious. She accused me of being petty and trying to cause drama over a bunch of old furniture. I stayed calm and told her that this wasn't about furniture, it was about respect. That didn't go over well. She demanded to know why I couldn't just let her have the desk since she needed it more. The noise drew my dad into the room, and he immediately tried to de-escalate the situation by suggesting we all calm down and talk. I told him there wasn't much to talk about. These were my belongings, and I was taking them home. He sighed and said I was making a big deal out of nothing. But I wasn't going to budge. That's when things really escalated. My mom started in with the guilt trips, asking if I really wanted to tear the family apart over a desk. My dad chimed in, saying my sister was under a lot of stress and that I was making her situation worse. Meanwhile, my sister kept ranting about how unfair I was being. I didn't raise my voice, but I did point out that taking someone else's property without permission wasn't just disrespectful, it could technically be considered theft. That shut everyone up for a moment. My sister scoffed and called me ridiculous, but I could tell the word theft hit a nerve. Ignoring the protests, I continued disassembling the desk. My mom begged me to reconsider, saying this wasn't worth the damage it would do to our family. I told her that the damage had already been done when they decided my things were up for grabs without asking me first. As I was finishing up with the desk, my cousin, yes, the same one who tipped me off about this whole situation, showed up unannounced. She was dropping something off for my mom, but when she walked in and saw what was happening, she immediately sided with me. She called out my sister's entitlement, saying it wasn't right for her to take my things without permission. That gave me a small boost of confidence, knowing I wasn't the only one who thought this was wrong. Of course, my sister wasn't having any of it. She started yelling about how I was ruining her chances to get back on her feet and that I should be helping her, not making things harder. I reminded her that she could have simply asked me directly instead of going behind my back. If she had, I might have been willing to help, but now, no chance. For the first time, my parents looked unsure. They didn't say much as I loaded the desk and chair into my car. Maybe they realized they'd overstepped, or maybe they just didn't want to argue anymore. Either way, they let me finish without trying to stop me. Before I left, I made one thing clear: I wasn't going to store anything at their house again. If this is how they treat my belongings, I can't trust them. They didn't say much in response, just watched as I drove off. On the way home, I felt a mix of emotions. I was relieved to have my things back, but the whole situation left a bitter taste in my mouth. This wasn't how family was supposed to act. I knew the fallout from this wasn't over, but at least I'd taken a stand. When I got home, I unpacked everything and logged onto Reddit to share the update. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive, with people saying I did the right thing and that it was about time I stood up for myself. Reading those responses made me feel a little better, like I wasn't overreacting. Now I just have to see how my family reacts. Something tells me this isn't the end of the drama. Update 2. After getting my desk and chair back, I thought the worst of it was behind me. I was wrong. My sister didn't waste any time letting me know how she felt about what happened. The first text came in the same day I took my stuff back. She called me selfish and accused me of trying to destroy her progress at first. I ignored it, but the messages kept coming, long paragraphs about how I was making her life harder, sprinkled with passive-aggressive comments like, "Must be nice to only think about yourself." She didn't stop there. I started hearing from extended family members who were apparently getting a very different version of the story. My sister told everyone that I ripped apart her office setup and left her with nothing. She conveniently left out the part where she took my things without asking. My parents didn't help either. They let her vent about me during family gatherings and even chimed in with their own complaints about how I was being too rigid and not understanding enough. It became clear that I wasn't going to get any kind of apology from them. Instead, they expected me to smooth things over. My mom left me a voicemail saying I should be the bigger person and talk to my sister to make things right. It was frustrating, to say the least, but I wasn't going to play into their narrative. I decided it was time to draw a line. I blocked my sister on social media and muted my parents' texts for a while. As I unpacked the desk and set it up in my apartment, I couldn't help but think about why it mattered so much to me. That desk wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was the first big purchase I made when I started working. It represented my independence. Seeing it in my space again felt like reclaiming a part of myself that my family had overlooked. Then, out of nowhere, I got a heads up from a family friend. She told me my parents were planning a family meeting to confront me about the whole situation. Apparently, my mom and sister had convinced a few relatives that I needed to be taught a lesson about sharing and family values. I wasn't entirely surprised, but it still stung to know how far they were willing to go. Not long after, my aunt called. She didn't beat around the bush. She accused me of causing unnecessary drama and said I should apologize to my sister for embarrassing her. I calmly explained my side of the story, but she wasn't having it. By the end of the call, it was clear she had already made up her mind about who was in the wrong. That was the final push I needed to set stricter boundaries. I started rethinking how much access I allowed my family to have in my life. When a coworker suggested family therapy, I laughed it off at first. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much these patterns had shaped my relationships. Not just with my family, but with other people too. For fun, I decided to run a private poll on Reddit. I explained the situation and asked others how they'd handle a family that constantly disrespected their boundaries. The responses were eye-opening. Most people said I wasn't overreacting and that I needed to protect my space, both physically and emotionally. Just when I thought things couldn't get more ridiculous, I found out my sister had been going through more of my belongings stored at my parents' house. A friend who stopped by for dinner casually mentioned seeing my old cookware in my sister's kitchen. That's when I realized this wasn't just about the desk and chair. This was a pattern of behavior. The final straw came when my parents admitted they had given away some of my clothes. My mom brushed it off, saying I never wore them anymore. I couldn't believe it. These weren't random items gathering dust. They were things I'd kept because they mattered to me. At that point, I decided I couldn't leave anything else at their house. The next weekend, I rented a small storage unit and spent an entire day clearing out every single item I had left at their place. Books, kitchen supplies, childhood mementos, everything came with me. By the time I was done, there was nothing left for them to claim as family property. As I packed up, I reflected on how much my parents' enabling had hurt not just me, but my sister too. Their constant favoritism and refusal to hold her accountable had left her with a sense of entitlement that was now ruining her relationships. I couldn't change their behavior, but I could choose not to let it drag me down anymore. After moving everything to the storage unit, I updated Reddit again. The post blew up even more than the first one. People praised me for standing my ground and shared their own stories of dealing with entitled family members. Some even offered advice on how to stay firm without burning bridges completely. I don't know what's going to happen next, but for now, I feel like I've taken a step in the right direction. My family might not like it, but I'm done being their doormat. Update 3. A few days after I cleared out the last of my belongings from my parents' house, I got a text from my dad. It read, "We need to talk. Everyone will be here Sunday." That was it. No details, no explanation. I didn't need one. I knew this was about the fallout from the desk incident and everything that followed. It was clearly a setup, but part of me wanted to see how far they'd take this. So on Sunday, I showed up. When I walked into the living room, it felt like walking onto the set of an intervention. My parents, my sister, and 2 of my aunts were sitting there waiting for me. Nobody offered me a seat, so I stayed standing, arms crossed. My sister was the first to speak. She launched into a tirade about how I'd destroyed her chance to get back on her feet and how I'd turned my back on her during her time of need. She painted herself as the victim, conveniently leaving out the part where she'd taken my things without permission. Then my mom jumped in, saying the family needed to stick together and that I was being unnecessarily combative. She brought up how hard my sister's life had been lately, as if that excused everything. My dad added that this could have all been avoided if I'd just let it go and focused on what really mattered, keeping the family together. I stayed calm and waited for them to finish before I responded. I explained again that the issue wasn't about a desk or a gaming console or any of the other things my sister had taken. It was about boundaries and respect. I reminded them that they didn't ask me if they could take my stuff. They just decided it was okay and expected me to accept it. That was the real problem. My sister cut me off and started talking about her hardships, emphasizing how she needed the desk to apply for jobs and the console to relieve stress. She made it sound like I was some heartless villain for taking them back. I let her finish and then pointed out the obvious. She could have asked me for help. If she'd been honest and upfront, I might have been willing to lend her the desk temporarily or help her out in some other way. But instead, she went behind my back, and that's why we were in this mess. At this point, my parents tried to shift the blame. My dad claimed he thought my mom had asked me for permission, and my mom insisted she assumed I wouldn't mind. It was the same excuses I'd heard before, and they weren't any more convincing the second time. They kept brushing it off as no big deal, which just proved my point. They didn't respect me or my property. I decided to stop sugarcoating things. I told them, point blank, that their behavior was enabling my sister's entitlement. Every time they made excuses for her or tried to guilt me into letting things slide, they were reinforcing the idea that she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. I made it clear that I wasn't going to tolerate it anymore. That's when my sister started crying. She accused me of being heartless and abandoning the family over something as trivial as furniture. She said I was acting like I didn't care about anyone but myself. It was over the top and dramatic, but my parents looked genuinely uncomfortable, like they weren't sure how to respond. I decided to drop the bombshell. I told them I'd already moved everything I owned out of their house. Every book, every piece of cookware, every sentimental item, it was all gone. That way there'd be no more misunderstandings or excuses about what belonged to who. My mom looked shocked, and my dad just shook his head. My sister looked furious, like she couldn't believe I'd taken away her free pass to raid my things. One of my aunts tried to mediate. She suggested that everyone apologize and move forward, but I wasn't interested in sweeping things under the rug. I told her that forgiveness requires accountability. If my parents and sister couldn't even acknowledge what they'd done wrong, there was nothing to move forward from. By this point, my parents were getting frustrated. They accused me of overreacting and said it was just stuff. I reminded them, again, that this wasn't about the stuff, it was about the principle. If they couldn't respect me enough to ask before taking my things, how could I trust them with anything else? I decided I'd had enough. I told them I wasn't going to tolerate being disrespected by anyone, even family, and walked out. Nobody followed me. When I got home, I updated Reddit about the ambush. The responses were overwhelmingly supportive. People told me I handled it perfectly and that I was right to stand up for myself. Some even shared similar stories of their own, which made me feel less alone. I don't know what my family will do next, but at this point, I'm done trying to fix things. If they can't respect my boundaries, they don't get a place in my life. Update 4. About a week after the family meeting ambush, I got a call from my sister. I almost didn't pick up. I'd blocked her on social media and had been ignoring her texts, so I wasn't sure what she wanted now. But curiosity got the better of me. She said she wanted to apologize and asked if we could meet for coffee. Her tone was uncharacteristically calm, which caught me off guard. I wasn't sure if she was being genuine or if this was another setup, but I agreed to meet her. We met at a small cafe near my place. She was already seated when I arrived, looking unusually serious. As soon as I sat down, she started talking. She admitted she was wrong to take my desk and other belongings without asking. She said she acted out of desperation because she was struggling and didn't know how to handle things. It was the first time I'd heard anything close to an acknowledgement of her actions, and for a moment, I thought maybe this was progress. But as she kept talking, the cracks started to show. She claimed our parents had told her it was fine to use my things, so she assumed I wouldn't care. Then she tried to justify keeping some of the smaller items, like my old books and kitchenware, because they were practically hers growing up. She was clearly trying to shift some of the blame onto our parents, and even onto me for not communicating better about what I wanted to keep. It felt less like an apology and more like damage control. She pivoted to talking about her current struggles, how hard it was living at home, being unemployed, and feeling like she was falling behind in life. I listened without interrupting, but but then she dropped a request: could I help her out financially while she got back on her feet? She claimed she was close to landing a job and just needed some support to get through the next few months. I drew the line. I told her I wasn't willing to give her money. I explained that I was open to rebuilding our relationship but couldn't support her financially or enable her behavior. She didn't take it well. Her tone shifted from apologetic to defensive. She said I was making her feel like a failure and that she was trying her best. She seemed to expect me to backpedal, but I stood firm. I told her that enabling her wouldn't help her grow. The best way I could support her was by being honest. If she wanted to move forward, she needed to take responsibility for her actions and start handling her problems without relying on others to bail her out. She didn't say much after that, just nodded and said she understood, but the tension in the air was thick. Later that evening, my mom called. She told me my sister was upset after our talk and felt I had been cruel and unforgiving. Mom started up the usual guilt trip, saying family should help each other and that I was being too hard on my sister. I didn't engage much. I just told her I was done discussing it and hung up. The next day, a friend sent me a screenshot of a Facebook post my sister had written. It was one of those vague, attention-seeking rants about unsupportive family members and how some people care more about stuff than relationships. She didn't name me directly, but it was obvious who she was talking about. The comments were full of sympathetic replies from relatives and her friends, all agreeing that she deserved better. I updated Reddit about the coffee meeting and the Facebook post, asking if I'd been too harsh. Once again, the responses were overwhelmingly supportive. People pointed out that her apology seemed more about optics than genuine remorse, and that I was right to protect my boundaries. Some even suggested I go low contact with my family for a while to avoid further drama. A close friend of mine reassured me I wasn't a bad brother for setting limits. She reminded me that boundaries are about respect, not punishment. If my sister couldn't respect my boundaries, that was on her, not me. At this point, I'm more convinced than ever that my sister's apology wasn't entirely sincere. It felt like she was trying to save face after the family meeting fallout and get something out of me in the process. Her actions since then, like the Facebook post, only reinforced that suspicion. For now, I've decided to keep my distance from her and my parents. I'm not cutting them off completely, but I'm not going to engage in their drama anymore. If they want a relationship with me, they'll have to start respecting my boundaries. Until then, I'm focusing on my own life and the people who genuinely support me. Update 5. After the coffee meeting with my sister and the Facebook post fallout, I decided to take the next steps to fully regain control over my life. I spent an entire weekend clearing out every single item I still had stored at my parents' house. I thought I had already removed most of my belongings, but I was wrong. While packing up, I found even more of my things in unexpected places: old books, kitchenware, and even a few small electronics I thought had been lost. It turned out my sister had been quietly using those as well. The final straw was finding my old cookware set in her boxes. It was something I'd bought for my first apartment and intentionally left behind only because I didn't have enough space at the time. Seeing how casually it had been absorbed into her inventory made me more certain than ever that I couldn't leave anything else in that house. I loaded everything into my car and rented a small storage unit to hold anything I didn't have room for in my apartment. By the end of the weekend, I officially had nothing left in their home. I let my parents know that I wouldn't be storing anything at their place ever again. This wasn't negotiable. My dad tried to act indifferent, but my mom gave me the usual guilt trip about making things harder than they need to be. I didn't argue or explain myself further. There was no point. After that, I decided to go low contact with my family. I didn't block anyone, but I stopped responding to anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. No more long phone calls, no more family updates, no more drama. I realized how much mental space the constant back and forth had been taking up, and I wasn't going to let it control me anymore. With all that energy freed up, I started focusing on myself for the first time in a long time. I took up new hobbies, reconnected with friends I'd drifted away from, and started making more plans for my future. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Meanwhile, my sister eventually found a part-time job. While I was genuinely glad she was making progress, my family quickly turned it into another source of pressure on me. They insisted the job wasn't enough to cover her expenses and started hinting, then outright saying, that I should chip in to help her. My mom even tried to frame it as a family responsibility, saying that it's what siblings are supposed to do. I made it clear that I wasn't going to pay for her mistakes or enable her bad habits. I reminded them that I wasn't responsible for her or their financial decisions. That's when my mom hit me with what she must have thought was her ace card. She told me that if I didn't start helping the family, she'd cut me off emotionally. I wasn't sure what that even meant, since she'd spent the past few months guilt-tripping me and siding with my sister. So I told her, as calmly as I could, that I'd survive just fine. Around this time, I started seeing a therapist. I'd always dismissed the idea in the past, but unpacking everything with a professional helped me understand how deep the dysfunction in my family ran. I realized I'd spent years trying to meet impossible expectations and maintain a relationship with people who didn't respect me as an individual. Therapy helped me let go of the guilt I'd been carrying and focus on building a life that worked for me, not for them. One unexpected bright spot came from my cousin, the same one who originally tipped me off about the desk. She reached out to say she admired how I stood up for myself and how I wasn't afraid to set boundaries, even with family. She said she'd had her own issues with similar dynamics and felt inspired to start pushing back too. It was nice to hear, especially since most of my interactions with family lately had been so negative. Meanwhile, my updates on Reddit gained even more traction. People seemed to resonate with my story and praise me for standing firm. Some shared their own experiences with overbearing families, and others encouraged me to keep prioritizing my mental health. It felt good to know I wasn't alone in dealing with these kinds of issues. Months later, my sister sent me another text. It was a lukewarm apology, claiming she wanted to move past everything and be a real family again, but by then, I didn't feel the need to engage. I didn't respond, and honestly, I didn't feel bad about it. If she's truly sorry, she'll show it through her actions, not her words. The family dynamic remains strained. Some relatives side with me, saying I was right to stand up for myself, while others still blame me for the conflict. I've made peace with the fact that I can't change how they feel. All I can do is control how much access they have to my life. In my final Reddit update, I thanked everyone for their support. Setting boundaries with family is never easy, but the advice and encouragement I received made it easier to stay strong. For the first time in years, I feel free from their expectations, their guilt trips, and their drama. I'm finally moving forward, on my terms. I'm a 22-year-old guy, currently in my final year of college, living with my parents to save some cash. I juggle a part-time job on the side, squeezing in hours between classes and assignments. My plan has always been to save up, finish school, and move out as soon as I can afford my own place. It's not like living here has been super easy. My parents are decent, but family dynamics have always been a bit complicated, to put it mildly. See, my cousin, let's call him Eric, is what everyone in the family calls the golden child. Eric's a few years older than me, but let's just say his life hasn't exactly gone according to plan. He's been bailed out by my family more times than I can count, and while I don't want to judge, it's been rough watching how my parents bend over backward to help him out. Meanwhile, I'm pretty much left to handle my own stuff, which is fine, but it's clear there's a double standard. Anyway, Eric's latest drama unfolded a couple of weeks ago. He got kicked out of his apartment after he couldn't pay rent for a few months. Apparently, he'd been avoiding his landlord's calls, hoping things would just magically work out. They didn't. Long story short, Eric's now out on the street, couch surfing with friends, and apparently my parents got wind of it. I didn't think too much of it. Eric's had trouble keeping a place before, and usually he figures it out eventually. One night after dinner, my parents called me into the living room. They had this serious, almost solemn look on their faces, which I hadn't seen in a while. I thought maybe something happened to someone in the family, so I sat down, bracing myself. My mom cleared her throat and said, "We've been talking, and we think it's best if Eric stays with us for a while." Before I could respond, my dad added, "He'll need your room." At first, I thought they were joking. I just blinked at them, waiting for the punchline, but they didn't say anything else. I finally managed to get out. "Wait, you want me to move out so Eric can take my room?" They nodded, looking at me like this was the most logical plan in the world. I was stunned. They could have suggested Eric stay on the couch or even in the guest room, but no, they wanted me to leave altogether. I told them this didn't make any sense. I reminded them I was in my final year, juggling work and school, and that moving out right now would completely derail my savings plan. But they just brushed it off, saying Eric's family, and he's going through a rough time. "You have a job, you'll be fine." My dad said that as the eldest cousin, I should understand that family comes first, and that Eric needs it more than I do right now. I wasn't having it. I tried explaining that kicking me out felt unfair, especially since Eric has a history of bad decisions and always relies on someone else to pick up the pieces. My parents didn't see it that way. Instead, they accused me of being selfish, saying I wasn't thinking about the family and that I should care more about helping Eric get back on his feet. They made it sound like I was the one being unreasonable, not the one getting kicked out of his own home. That's when things started getting heated. My dad raised his voice, saying I was acting entitled and that if I didn't want to help my family, then maybe I didn't belong here after all. My mom just sat there, nodding along like this was all perfectly logical. I could feel the frustration boiling up, but I knew I couldn't convince them. They'd already made up their minds. They even told me I had a week to figure something out, like I was some tenant they could evict whenever they pleased. I left the conversation angry, my mind racing with options. I vented to a few friends about the situation, and they were as baffled as I was. One of them even offered me a temporary place to crash if I needed it, but the thought of leaving on my parents' terms didn't sit right with me. I'd worked hard to make this arrangement work, saving money, balancing work and school, and now it felt like all of that was being tossed aside for my cousin's benefit. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I knew I had to take a stand, even if it meant things getting ugly. I wasn't about to let them push me out so easily. I started formulating a plan, realizing that if they really wanted to go through with this, I'd make them understand exactly what they were sacrificing. If they were willing to kick me out for Eric, they'd better be prepared to lose me altogether. That night, I posted my situation on Reddit, half venting, half looking for advice. Within hours, my post had blown up, and the comments were flooded with people telling me to stand my ground. Some even suggested I look into tenant rights, just in case my parents tried to pull something drastic. Reading through the responses made me feel less alone and gave me the motivation to start preparing for what I knew would be a serious confrontation. As the days ticked down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a family argument. This was a test, a chance for me to stand up for myself and make it clear that I wasn't going to be pushed around anymore. Update 1. After that initial confrontation, things in the house turned icy. My parents stopped talking to me altogether, which I'll admit made things pretty awkward. They acted like I didn't exist, not saying a word about the situation, almost as if their silence alone would pressure me into giving in, but I held my ground. A couple of days later, Eric showed up with his stuff, a couple of duffel bags and some boxes. He walked right past me, barely making eye contact, like he was trying to pretend this wasn't awkward for both of us. My parents directed him to my room. and that's when I put my foot down. I told them that until I was officially moving out, Eric's stuff wasn't going to be taking over my space. He could keep his things in the guest room, or the living room for all I cared, but not in my room while I was still here. My parents exchanged looks, clearly annoyed, but they didn't argue. They acted like it was some huge inconvenience, but they let Eric keep his things in the guest room for the time being. I noticed my dad kept sighing dramatically every time he walked past, and my mom would give me these looks that could burn holes through concrete. Meanwhile, Eric avoided eye contact, almost like he didn't want to be dragged into the tension any more than he already was. As the days went on, it became clear that my parents weren't about to change their minds. They started making little comments here and there, bringing up how Eric needed the support right now, and that family always makes sacrifices. It was obvious they expected me to cave and just move out without further complaints. But I wasn't about to let that happen. Meanwhile, I started running the numbers and realized that moving out now would force me to dip heavily into my savings. I'd been working part-time to build up enough money to get my own place after graduation, and burning through those savings now would set me back months. Not to mention, with my busy schedule, finding a new place in such a short time would be almost impossible. I could already see my plans slipping away, all because my parents wanted to hand my room over to Eric. A few days after Eric arrived, my parents gave me their own ultimatum. They told me that if I didn't willingly leave, they'd have no choice but to force me out. That's when I decided it was time to turn things around on them. I reminded them that I'd been paying my own way, contributing financially to the household whenever I could. I even hinted that if they pushed me out, they'd be losing whatever support I'd been offering, both financially and otherwise. This seemed to catch them off guard. I don't think they expected me to push back this hard. My dad went quiet, looking genuinely taken aback, while my mom tried to keep her composure, though I could tell she was rattled. They hadn't anticipated that I might actually walk away from this arrangement entirely. Around that time, my younger sibling pulled me aside. They told me privately that they thought the whole situation was unfair, and they'd try talking to our parents if I wanted. I appreciated the support, but I knew it wouldn't make much of a difference. My parents seemed determined to keep Eric around, no matter how it affected me. Still, knowing my sibling was on my side gave me a bit of reassurance that I wasn't entirely alone in this mess. Eric, for his part, looked uncomfortable with the whole thing. Whenever my parents brought up the situation in front of him, he'd shift around awkwardly, clearly not wanting to get involved. But he never said anything to change the situation. He just let them handle the confrontation, staying out of the argument while I fought to keep my place in my own home. Despite not wanting to leave on their terms, I started looking at alternative options. A friend offered me a room temporarily, but it felt like I'd be running away if I took it. I didn't want to give my parents the satisfaction of thinking they'd won by making me move out without a fight. But my parents didn't back down. They kept insisting I was being overly dramatic and that I needed to think about the family. It was getting exhausting hearing the same arguments over and over. A friend of mine, seeing how frustrated I was, suggested that I look into tenant rights. They pointed out that technically I was paying part of the household expenses, so my parents might not be able to just kick me out without notice. That got me thinking, and I realized they might actually be right. When I updated Reddit, people flooded the comments with advice about my rights, suggesting I get a formal agreement or even consider taking legal steps if my parents tried to force me out. The support and encouragement I got from Reddit was overwhelming, and it helped me feel more confident that I wasn't completely at my parents' mercy here. So, I gave my parents one final choice. I told them that if they forced me out, I'd be cutting ties completely. They'd lose any support or connection we had, and I'd walk away, no looking back. I made it clear that this was their last chance to reconsider before things reached the point of no return. I didn't raise my voice or argue, I just stated it plainly, giving them a week to decide. Now, all I can do is wait and see what they choose. Update 2. After a few days of tense silence, my parents finally agreed to sit down and talk. I think my ultimatum rattled them more than they wanted to admit. They reluctantly called a family meeting, making it clear that they weren't thrilled about it. The whole family gathered in the living room, including Eric, who sat off to the side, looking awkward and avoiding eye contact. Once we were all settled, I laid out my terms. I told them that if I was going to stay, there needed to be clear boundaries and respect. I wasn't about to get kicked around just because Eric needed help. If they wanted me to contribute financially, I was willing to discuss fair contributions, but I wasn't going to be treated like a second-class family member. At this, Eric let out a low mutter, something along the lines of causing unnecessary drama. My parents didn't react to his comment, but I saw their faces tighten, like they were already annoyed at the whole situation. I kept going, making it clear that I wasn't asking for anything unreasonable, just basic respect and a clear understanding of my role in the household if I was to stay. My parents exchanged uneasy glances, then reluctantly agreed to let me stay, for now. But they didn't hide their displeasure. It was obvious they'd hoped I'd just give in and move out quietly. They even brought up the idea of me paying extra rent if I insisted on staying, claiming it would be only fair since I was taking up space that Eric could use. This suggestion hit me as ridiculous. I told them firmly that I wasn't paying extra just to keep my own room, especially considering Eric wasn't expected to contribute anything financially. That's when my younger sibling spoke up, siding with me. They pointed out how unfair it was that I'd be asked to pay more while Eric got a free pass. Their support seemed to give my argument more weight, and I could tell my parents weren't expecting them to back me up. It felt like a small victory, though it clearly didn't sit well with anyone else. After that, things in the house grew tense. Eric started acting resentful, and I could feel the hostility radiating from him whenever we crossed paths. He'd make snide remarks under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear. Little digs about how I was making everything harder than it needed to be or selfish for not wanting to help family. My parents would shoot me disappointed looks every time he said something, as if they silently agreed with him. They didn't stop there. My parents began ramping up the guilt trips, talking about how family is supposed to make sacrifices and how disappointing it was that I was being so stubborn. Every conversation felt like a trap, with them trying to twist everything I said into some kind of selfish act. I could feel the pressure building, but I stayed firm. I wasn't about to cave now. I turned back to Reddit for advice, updating everyone on the situation. The response was overwhelming, with people urging me to stand my ground and reminding me that I had every right to set boundaries. Many suggested documenting everything in case things escalated further. I took that advice to heart, keeping a record of the conversations and taking note of every small escalation. Then, things took an interesting turn. A few family friends who'd heard about the situation reached out to me privately, offering their support. They said they were on my side and thought the whole arrangement was unfair. Knowing that others outside of Reddit also saw the injustice in the situation gave me a bit of strength. It was nice to have that extra validation, especially from people who knew my family. In response, my parents seemed to double down. They started subtly punishing me around the house, giving me extra chores and making more demands. They'd leave dishes in the sink, expecting me to clean up after everyone, or give me vague responsibilities that I apparently wasn't meeting, just as a way to make me look uncooperative. Every day there was something new, some little way they could make things harder on me, almost like they were hoping I'd get frustrated enough to leave on my own. In the meantime, I started looking at my options for a more permanent exit. I realized that this situation wasn't sustainable, and it might be better for my own sanity to plan a way out, even if it took a bit longer than I wanted. I began scoping out other places and saving more aggressively, setting a mental timeline to move out within the next year. I knew I'd need to get through this phase first, but having a concrete plan gave me something to hold on to. Finally, I restated my ultimatum. I sat my parents down one more time and told them that either they respected me as an equal member of the household or they'd lose me altogether. This wasn't an empty threat. I was ready to follow through if things continued down this path. I made it clear that I wasn't going to keep bending over backward for Eric or anyone else, and if they kept pushing, they'd have to deal with the consequences. They didn't give me a straight answer that day, but I could tell they were shaken. Update 3. After that last confrontation, my parents decided to completely ignore my ultimatum. They gave me the silent treatment, acting like I wasn't even there. Whenever I entered a room, they'd leave or pretend to be busy. I tried not to let it get to me, but the atmosphere in the house felt like a constant reminder that I wasn't welcome. Meanwhile, Eric started making himself at home. He spread his stuff all over the communal spaces, leaving his shoes by the front door, his jacket thrown over the couch, and his bags taking up space in the hallway. It was like he was marking his territory, almost daring me to say something. My parents didn't seem to mind, of course. In fact, they acted like this was all completely normal, like Eric had every right to take over the house. One day, I came home to find that Eric had commandeered the TV in the living room, watching his shows and leaving empty soda cans on the coffee table. When I asked him to clean up, he just gave me a smirk and shrugged it off, saying, "Isn't this your job?" I knew he was baiting me, but the lack of respect was infuriating. Anytime I tried to bring up these small issues with my parents, they'd immediately side with Eric. If I pointed out that he was taking over the common areas, they'd brush it off, saying I was being difficult. Even if Eric left a mess, they'd somehow twist it into being my fault, claiming I was the one causing tension in the family. No matter what he did, I was always the one in the wrong. Frustrated, I decided to take things a step further and consulted with a legal advisor about my situation. I wanted to know my rights, just in case my parents tried to force me out. The advisor confirmed that, since I'd been paying part of the household expenses, I had some tenant rights, which meant they couldn't just kick me out without proper notice. It was a small reassurance, but at least it gave me a bit of a safety net. My younger sibling, who'd been quiet during most of this, started opening up more. They admitted they felt just as overlooked as I did and confided that they, too, were tired of our parents always prioritizing Eric. We started talking more, sharing frustrations and offering each other support. It was nice to have someone in the house who understood what I was dealing with. Meanwhile, Eric's behavior got worse. He'd leave dishes in the sink, expecting me to wash them, or toss his dirty laundry in the hallway, waiting for someone else to pick it up. It was like he'd appointed himself king of the house, and I was supposed to serve him. My friends were getting fed up just hearing about it, and they kept urging me to get out. A few even offered their couches if I needed a place to crash, but I wasn't ready to give in just yet. I updated my Reddit post, explaining how things had escalated, and the response was overwhelming. The post went viral, with thousands of people weighing in, telling me to prioritize my self-respect and set boundaries. Some of them gave practical advice about how to handle the situation, while others shared similar stories. The support was huge, and it helped me feel like I wasn't going through this alone. Then, things took an unexpected turn. My parents somehow found out about my Reddit post. They confronted me, accusing me of airing family matters in public and making them look bad online. The irony wasn't lost on me. They didn't seem concerned about how they were treating me, only that people were finding out about it. The confrontation escalated quickly, with them demanding I take the post down, but I refused. I told them that if they didn't want people knowing about the situation, maybe they should think about their actions. After that argument, I knew I had to make a new plan. I told them that if things didn't change, I'd move out within a month. I'd rather struggle on my own than live in a house where I was treated like an outsider. My parents tried to smooth things over with a half-hearted apology, saying they didn't mean for things to go this far, but I could tell they weren't sincere. It felt like they were more concerned with maintaining appearances than actually making things right. They eventually agreed, reluctantly, to let me stay without harassing me, at least temporarily. But the damage was done. I'd already decided that I needed to leave as soon as I could. I began saving aggressively, cutting back on expenses and making plans to find my own place within the next year. Knowing I had an exit strategy made it a little easier to handle the day-to-day stress at home. Through all this, my bond with my younger sibling grew stronger. We'd always gotten along, but dealing with this situation brought us closer than ever. We promised to look out for each other, no matter how things played out. It felt like the only positive thing to come out of this whole mess, and I held on to that. For now, I'm still here, but I've made it clear to my parents that this is temporary. Once I have enough saved, I'm out. And next time, I won't be giving them any ultimatums, I'll just be gone. Update 4. After the shaky truce my parents had reluctantly offered, it didn't take long for their hostility to resurface. It was subtle at first, extra little comments under their breath, quiet conversations that would suddenly stop when I walked into a room. They began acting as if I'd overstayed my welcome, making it clear that I was, in their eyes, just a burden they couldn't wait to get rid of. Eric, sensing he had their favor, took things up a notch. He started treating the house like it was his, stretching his boundaries a bit further each day. My things would mysteriously shift around, showing up in odd places like the hallway, or even the storage closet. One night, I came home after a late shift to find some of my personal items from my room stacked in a corner of the living room. When I checked my room, I saw that Eric had moved his gaming console and a bunch of his clothes into the space I'd cleared out to keep things organized. I confronted my parents about it, pointing out the disrespect, but they brushed it off, claiming I was being too sensitive. They said that if I cared about family, I'd be more accommodating. I couldn't believe it. The fact that my own belongings were being treated like they didn't matter at all, like they could just be moved whenever it suited Eric, was infuriating. As if the constant dismissal wasn't enough, my parents began increasing my responsibilities around the house. They piled on extra chores, saying it was time I started contributing more to the household. These weren't regular chores either, they were things that were obviously just meant to wear me down, cleaning out the garage alone, taking over grocery shopping, and other tedious tasks that weren't previously part of my routine. I could tell they were trying to make me feel like a nuisance, as if to drive me out of the house without explicitly telling me to leave. Seeing all of this unfold was too much for my younger sibling, who finally reached a breaking point. They confronted my parents directly, saying that the treatment I was getting was unfair, and that they should start respecting me and my space. My parents didn't take well to this at all. In response, they grounded my sibling for talking back, showing just how unwilling they were to acknowledge any wrongdoing. It was clear they were fully committed to their decision to prioritize Eric over anyone else. Eric, of course, didn't make things any easier. He noticed the tension between my sibling and our parents and took advantage of it, trying to win over my sibling by offering them small gifts and attempting to bond over shared interests. It only added to the tension, making my sibling feel torn between staying loyal to me and trying to maintain some kind of peace at home. The stress of it all started taking a toll on my health. I began experiencing chest pains and frequent headaches, symptoms I'd never dealt with before. One day, it got so bad that I had to go to the hospital. After running some tests, the doctor attributed it to stress, urging me to prioritize my well-being. When I told my parents, they dismissed it, saying I was overreacting and acting dramatic. Their lack of concern only solidified my decision to get out as soon as possible. My friends noticed my health declining too and rallied around me. They reminded me that my mental and physical health had to come first, offering their places if I needed a temporary escape. Even my employer saw that something was off, and they offered me extra shifts, hinting that I could use the additional income to save up faster. I was incredibly grateful for the support outside the house, knowing that I wasn't completely on my own in this situation. As usual, I turned to Reddit to share what had been happening, and once again, the community responded with overwhelming support. My post went viral, with thousands of people encouraging me to cut ties and leave. Many of them shared their own experiences with toxic family dynamics, and reading through their stories gave me a boost of determination to finally break free. Word must have spread beyond Reddit, because a few days later, an unexpected visitor arrived at our house, a family friend who had heard about the situation through my sibling. They came over specifically to confront my parents, urging them to reconsider how they were treating me and warning them that they were at risk of damaging our relationship permanently. It was a surreal moment, watching someone else say the things I'd been saying for months, but even then, my parents stood their ground. They maintained that Eric was family and needed support, refusing to acknowledge the toll this was taking on me. That was the final straw for me. I knew then that I couldn't wait any longer. I decided that I'd be moving out within the month no matter what. I was done with the games, the manipulation, and the constant dismissal. I started packing the few things I had left in my room, organizing my belongings and planning out my exit. I knew that if I stayed any longer, I'd only be hurting myself. It was time to make a clean break and finally prioritize my own well-being. Now I'm counting down the days until I can leave, determined to close this chapter of my life for good. Update 5. After making my decision, I set a firm move-out date 3 weeks away. It felt both liberating and nerve-wracking, but having that concrete deadline helped me focus on my plan. A close friend, who'd been following the whole mess, offered me a room in their apartment temporarily. This gave me the final push I needed, knowing I had a reliable place lined up for when I left. My younger sibling, who'd been my main support at home, was upset about my decision but completely understood. They even voiced frustration at our parents' refusal to treat me fairly, which only strengthened my resolve. It wasn't easy watching them struggle with the reality that things were about to change permanently, but they assured me they'd stay in touch no matter what. When Eric found out I was officially moving, his attitude took a weird turn. He suddenly started acting friendly, throwing out casual comments like, "Hey, maybe we can hang out sometime after you settle in," as if we'd somehow be on good terms once I was gone. I ignored him, focusing instead on what needed to be done before the move. My parents, however, wasted no time trying to guilt trip me. They went on about how I was abandoning family and how I was overreacting just because they wanted to help Eric. I listened without reacting, calmly telling them that this decision wasn't about anyone but me. I wasn't going to back down or change my mind, and I was doing this for my own well-being. To make sure there'd be no issues on moving day, I consulted a lawyer friend about my rights. He assured me that as long as I left peacefully, my parents couldn't interfere or try to block me from leaving. Knowing my rights helped me feel more prepared to handle any last-minute drama that might come up. I started packing up my belongings in the evenings, carefully boxing up my books, clothes, and personal items. My sibling helped me late at night to avoid drawing attention, quietly handing me things to pack. Each box we taped up felt like a step closer to freedom, and we both held on to the promise that we'd stay connected, even if we wouldn't be seeing each other as often. As my move-out date approached, my parents grew more openly hostile. They'd make jabs about my selfishness and confidently predict that I'd come crawling back once I realized how hard life can be. I ignored the comments, but each one only solidified my decision. My friends, seeing how things were going, decided to throw me a small going-away party at a nearby cafe, which honestly meant the world to me. For the first time in a while, I felt surrounded by genuine support and love. They reminded me that I had a strong network outside of my family, and that I wasn't making this decision alone. The night before my move, my sibling and I had a long, heartfelt conversation. We talked about everything that had happened and promised to stay close no matter what. It felt bittersweet knowing I'd be leaving them behind in a situation I'd been so desperate to escape. But they assured me they'd manage and that they'd visit me as often as they could. We both knew this wasn't really goodbye, just a new beginning. Finally, moving day arrived. I'd packed everything up and loaded most of my stuff into my friend's car when my parents approached me one last time. They made a final, desperate attempt to convince me to stay, saying they never meant to push me away and that they just wanted to support Eric during a tough time. I thanked them for the roof over my head, for what it was worth, but I was firm I needed to prioritize my happiness, and that meant leaving. They tried to argue, but I remained calm, told them this was the best decision for me, and walked away. The moment I left, Eric wasted no time in claiming my room. Before I'd even made it to my friend's apartment, my sibling texted me, saying that Eric had already started rearranging things and moving his stuff in, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. It was confirmation, if I needed any more, that leaving was the right decision. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders as I realized that I was finally free from the toxic environment I'd been living in. Settling into my friend's apartment that evening felt surreal. I set up my things in the spare room and, for the first time in ages, felt a sense of peace. Later that night, I logged onto Reddit and posted a final update, sharing the whole story from start to finish and thanking everyone for their support. The response was overwhelming, thousands of people commenting, congratulating me on reclaiming my independence, and sharing stories of their own experiences with similar family dynamics. It felt like a massive chapter of my life was closing, and I was ready for whatever came next. This whole experience taught me a lot, but the biggest lesson was that sometimes you have to put yourself first, even if it means walking away from people who should have been there for you. I'm finally free, and for the first time in a long time, I'm looking forward to the future.